Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a big deal. It's a big deal to consider laws that do not involve the naming of a road or do not involve whether or not we're going to regulate pet stores. I don't mean to minimize other legislation, but what I'm saying is that when we come to this issue, we come to the core of how we've been established. We come to the core of how we treat the Constitution, as you heard from Representative Woog. So I think there are a few issues here that deserve illumination. I think the first is exactly that. It's a question of how do we interpret the Constitution? Is it a list of things like a menu in a restaurant where we say, well, we like a lot of this, and we think the First Amendment's really important because that's our freedom of speech, and so that's inviolate. That is absolutely never, ever going to be anything that we do about that. Second Amendment, I don't like as much maybe because, you know, it doesn't seem to be clear about modern day applications. The Fifth Amendment, why do we really need the Fifth Amendment? If you don't have anything to hide, why should you worry about it? How do we look through that list? How do we look through the very document that tells us the relationship between the people and their government? Because we are the government in this instance. I think that's a big question, and I think that many of us share what you heard from Representative Woog, that this document applies today as it applied then. It is one of the absolute miracles of the American experiment, is that the thoughtful consideration of what went into that document and how the Constitution marked out the relationship between the people and its government is entirely too important to mess with. And certainly too important to mess with when there are other questions that revolve around a bill such as this. We had a conversation, and Representative Neville is to be congratulated on really thinking about what is the need for the practical application of a law like this. And that means when confronted with a situation where law enforcement sees a weapon that is not stored properly, now what? Do we give them the latitude in law to make sure that they correct the action if what we heard yesterday is true, that what is desired is a change in behavior? Or do we really want to simply criminalize an action? Because those are two very different things. I mentioned that it was highly unlikely if we'd just changed the speed limit on a road that the very next day an officer would write you a ticket. Because the practicality of what the driver is expected to know and the situation that they have lived under for their entire lifetimes changes overnight, we know that the likelihood is that we need to have that elasticity in what that law looks like. But there's some other questions that I think as a body we need to struggle with, because we consistently have conversations in this room, in these committees, in our stakeholder meetings about what it is that we are about and what can we do in this 73rd legislative session that affects other legislatures. And this bill actually has a piece of it that is of terrible concern. What it says is we want to pass this law and we really want this education component. Well, I don't want to pass this law. I think the education components we have today are just fine. But what this bill says is, but we're not going to pay for it. We're just going to pass this law and then we're going to foist that responsibility out into the future somewhere. I don't find that acceptable. But when we really get down to what we've heard in this well and what we heard yesterday, I come back to exactly where we come back so often, and why I think it's important to remember the diversity of experience and the diversity of thought that exists on both sides of this aisle. Because when we consider a bill like this, and we hear stories about, well, what if you need that firearm to defend yourself or to defend your livestock? We look at this as if there was only one lens. But there are a number of lenses, and one of the biggest is exactly what we heard about earlier, which is a divide, a growing divide, between how things apply in urban Colorado and how things apply in rural and frontier Colorado. If what we meant when we took this oath is that we are here to do our job for the state as a whole, then that's where we need to step 2 steps back and say, how does this bill apply? How does this bill apply in Haxton? How does this bill apply in Kim, Colorado? In Montrose? How does this bill apply in Aurora? Or in Boulder? Or in Colorado Springs? I think the highest calling we have is to make sure that when we pass laws, we ask those questions. And that we not only consider the answers, but that we consider them in the middle of debate. When we don't feel like we have come to a conclusion and everything else is just a cacophony of noise. Because when we come to this well and we have a debate on second reading, if all we're doing is getting up to preach to the camera or somewhere else, then we're not doing our jobs. If we've already settled on the solution and therefore this is just mechanism, I'm worth more than that. My ideas are worth more than that. Your ideas are worth more than that. Because what was presented yesterday, what has been talked about today, is quite literally a different perspective. And if what we're going to talk about is inclusion and diversity, then this is that painful moment where we really all do need to say, there might be another way of looking at this. And maybe that amendment is a good amendment. Because we get to make those decisions. We get to make those decisions in this room. So we're going to take a third reading vote today. We are going to likely have people with very different opinions about this bill. Cast your minds back in the weeks to come about the different opinions you heard here. And so not in the moment of debate and not in the moment of taking this final recorded vote, but as we go forward, cast your minds back to this debate and think back to some of the ideas that were offered. And come and talk about the value of those ideas and how they could have been made better or how they affected you and your decision about this, because I can't believe that none of the good ideas presented were good enough to make it on paper. So I think we've got a lot of big questions on this, but really the biggest question I think is, how do we make this state better for all of us, taking into account what that means for all of us?